Today we will try to understand how the current situation in the Middle East is similar to the past of India. To understand this, we will look at history, which includes many aspects, and when we put all these things together, a clear picture will come in front of us. Then we will understand why the situation in the Middle East is so bad and why it feels like every terrorist is a Muslim, which is a completely wrong perception. Although their culture, lifestyle, and food habits are different, there is one thing that is similar between them, and this similarity connects the past of one with the current situation of the other. Human civilization has gone through different stages over time, which have changed with the passage of time. In today's world, many people are being made to believe that Muslims are terrorists. This perception mostly comes from Indian and Western media, where it is presented as every terrorist is a Muslim. But this has nothing to do with any religion. Actually, it is related to the economy, and we will prove that wherever the fuel of the world's economy is found, that place often becomes the center of war and conflicts. And all these are interest-based wars because the invader has different interests and the defender has different ones. The invader wants to take control of resources so that they can increase their own power, which also boosts their ability to attack further. But the defender's goal is to protect their homeland because for them it's a matter of existence and survival. Now, if the defender becomes strong enough that the invader ends up wasting more resources than the expected benefit, then the invader is forced to back off because continuing the attack starts making them weaker. Now, if the defender lives on a land that is rich in resources, then this wealth and abundance can weaken their defensive ability, because due to the comfort that comes with having plenty of resources, they don't feel the need to struggle for more. As a result, instead of getting into conflict, they start relying more on sharing. That's why people living on resource-rich lands naturally don't become invaders, because when you become an invader, you have to spend and waste your own resources. Wars always come with uncertainty, and your own wealth also gets used up or lost. And when using those resources doesn't bring a fruitful result, then why would anyone want to waste their valuable assets? For example, if we talk about India, in history, why was it attacked by invaders again and again, and why is it not happening now? To understand this, let's look at the world map. You can clearly see that India naturally has fertile land. That's why India appears green on the map. Whereas invaders usually come from areas where there is a lack of resources. Now, someone might ask, if the map shows countries like Europe, Africa, Russia, and America as green too, then why was only India targeted? To answer this question, we need to understand a little bit about each of these regions. The USA is naturally quite isolated from the rest of the world. At that time, the technology to reach and take control of its resources didn't exist. Even today, this same geographical isolation keeps America safe, because it's not easy for anyone to cross such a vast ocean and take away its resources. Now, when it comes to Russia and Europe, we see that there was no major invasion from these regions at that time, because as we discussed earlier, when you already have resources, why would you waste them in uncertain wars? It's important to note that we are talking about all of this in the context of the agricultural age. And when it comes to Africa, historically it was also attacked, but there is one key difference. The first thing is that in the middle of Africa's green areas, there is a large desert, which was a major obstacle to cross. But an even bigger reason was that the evolution of human society in Africa was slower compared to India, and the main reason for this was its geographical location. But in the case of India, the Indus and Persian civilizations had become highly developed, and they also had trade connections with China. That's why this influence also reached India, and its civilization developed in a much better way compared to the civilizations in Africa. They moved beyond the tribal system and started forming empires, which led to the establishment of many kingdoms in India. Even today, there are human civilizations in both India and Africa that are unaware of the modern world and still live within their tribal systems. In India, they are called Adivasi. These people are very simple and remain closely connected to their tribal systems. That's why we can clearly see the effects of these reforms on India even today. And interestingly, even after India gained independence, these tribal systems still existed, and the Indian state carried out brutal operations against them to gain control over those areas. After that came the Industrial Revolution, which gave birth to colonization. As a result, the world's attention shifted towards fossil fuels. This led to an even bigger boom in human greed. Now, instead of just focusing on India, powerful nations started looking for resources elsewhere and began taking control of more regions. As we saw, the regions that were green, meaning agriculturally rich, did not have a centralized governance system in the beginning. On the other hand, the Persian and Indus Valley regions adopted the feudal system to gain control over resources, and eventually kingdoms were established there. But then came the Industrial Revolution, which aimed to end that system, and the Industrial Revolution began in Europe. The resources that were not available in Europe, like spices, were bought by European countries from these kingdoms. Now that the Europeans had gained a technological edge, they ended these kingdoms because when they had the power, why would they keep giving money to weak states? Instead, they got direct access to the main markets themselves and eventually established their own rule there. They would also punish those who resisted them, label them as enemies of the state, and call their acts of resistance terrorism. Just like today, actual resistance and struggle for rights are often called terrorism, so that the voice of protest can be painted in a dark light, and the world is told that we are peaceful and these people are enemies of peace. In reality, it is often those in power who have occupied the land, but anyone who speaks against this system is given the label of a terrorist, just to make sure no one feels sympathy for them. It wasn't that there was only one political system in the world, rather the world was now taking a new turn. It had become a battle between capitalism and communism. The colonial struggle between these two powers eventually led us from the First World War to the Second World War. Now, after shedding so much human blood and wasting so much energy, the so-called world leaders, who themselves had also become weak by then, they did agree to a ceasefire, but the capitalist system had the upper hand. It's not that communism was a perfect system, but at that point it was in a weak position. Then the capitalists divided these areas in such a way that the control over natural resources remained in the hands of the capitalist system. This led to the beginning of the Cold War, where instead of fighting directly, they started achieving their goals through proxies. For this, they placed leaders of their own choice in these countries and very easily took control of the resources. All of this was going smoothly, but as we mentioned, this was the time of the Cold War, so communism was also making its moves. And when communism started to spread, it became nothing less than a nightmare for the capitalist system. On top of that, during the same period, a revolution took place in Iran, which was different from both systems. But as the saying goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend. So to counter Russia, America started supporting the local forces in Afghanistan while Russia began supporting Iran. As a result of the revolution, Iran also slipped out of the hands of the capitalist system, even though it used to be one of their colonies, just like Saudi Arabia and Pakistan. This is why, after the revolution, the relations of Saudi Arabia and Pakistan with Iran were no longer the same. On the other hand, Russia was entering Afghanistan, and the reason behind this was also the changing political shift caused by the capitalist system. To stop this shift, Afghanistan's political leadership was assassinated. That's why they used the locals, so they could claim that this was a local resistance against communism. But the capitalist system saw another threat alongside communism, and that was the Islamic Revolution. Because the revolution in Iran was brought by the Shia community, which makes up only about 10 to 15% of the total Muslim population. This could become a huge inspiration for entire nations, that if such a small part of the Muslim world could overthrow a capitalist-backed monarchy in their country, then why couldn't others do the same? And as it's often portrayed, there are differences between Shia and Sunni, and that's true to some extent. But despite those differences, both groups lived together for 623 years under the Ottoman Empire. If the hatred between them was truly as deep as it is shown today, then the Ottoman Empire could never have lasted that long. And we see the same policy in the case of India, where the capitalist system also exploited Hindu-Muslim differences to serve its own interests. That's why if they didn't crush the Iranian Revolution, it was very possible that the people of Arab countries might also rise up in rebellion. And that could lead to the fall of the kingdoms in those regions, which would mean the end of their control over the Middle East. That's why, even here, the capitalist system created a weak point deliberately. And they gave rise to the Shia-Sunni conflict because Iran has a Shia majority. So it was presented as Iran wanted to take control over the entire Arab world. However, in this video we will not go deeper into that topic, because this is a complete topic on its own which we will cover in another video. For now, we just want to make it clear that terrorism has nothing to do with Muslim ideology. Rather, it is linked to economic expansion. Anyone who goes against the system is given the label of a terrorist, with the purpose of creating a negative perception about them among the people. And it's not that every terrorist is actually raising their voice for their rights or doing an act of resistance, but not every act of resistance is terrorism either. In fact, the system itself creates certain people who help justify its own actions. These individuals are used as a basis to convince the public that the system is simply protecting them, and through this it also gets a reason to eliminate genuine resistance movements. That's why before calling anyone a terrorist, we must ask, is this person really on the wrong side, or are they standing for what's right? And to hate someone or to believe any lie about them just because they don't belong to our religion or sect is something that pulls us away from the very essence of humanity, the humanity that God created us for.